Hi, everybody. It's S.J. Thomason with Christian-apologist.com, or you could call it Psalm 23 Apologetics, whatever you want to call it. That's great. Just call it. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Dr. Nose. I see you in the audience right now, and I'm always very happy to see you. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about Paul's letter to the Corinthians and his letter to the Romans and how that was a real game changer. And why that was because Paul was really telling them, he was calling them out for their behavior, especially sexual immorality. And so I just want you to take this and think about the Roman Empire in the context of what we have today, because a lot of the same problems that they have with respect to immorality are being repeated again in our society today. And so we're noticing a lot of societies are doing that. So before we get to that, and before we get to Paul's letters, and also we'll speak a little bit about Acts 18, where Luke writes about Paul and Priscilla and Aquilla and their visits to Corinth. We want to talk about what ancient society was like back then. And so we know that in 146 BC, Corinth was brutally destroyed by the Romans. And the women and children were sold off as slaves, and the men were killed. And so then around 46 BC, it resurrected and Corinth came back to life. And what's really interesting about Corinth is it was sort of at the center of trade. So you had an east-west route that intersected right with the north-south route in Corinth. They also had about 30 bars, apparently they've excavated that in downtown Corinth. And at these bars, they had these little rooms where people could go off and do things with each other after getting drunk. And so that's been found and excavated. So that's kind of an interesting thing. They've also shown in Rome a lot of interesting things too. Like there were a lot of public baths. So people would go and they would bathe in these public baths. But going back to Corinth, Corinth was known as a carnal city. That was a nickname in Paul's time for it. It's also called Sin City and Vanity Fair. Now, I have been to Sin City here in the United States. Who can guess where Sin City is? Sin City is in Las Vegas. That would be our equivalent. And I've heard that in Dubai, that's the Muslim equivalent of what would be called Sin City. And so I will just take a quick segue to say what happened when I went to Sin City. So I was there a few years ago, I think about 6 or 7 years ago. I was at a conference with the Small Business Institute, and this is just my picture of Sin City. I arrived there, and this is a couple of memories that I have from that trip. I went to the slot machines, and I started playing for a little while. I won $60. I was so happy. I stopped playing. I called my husband. I announced I won the lottery because I won $60, and that was my gambling for that trip. I'm not much of a gambler. I don't like gambling because I hate losing my money that I worked so hard to earn. But anyway, so going back to Las Vegas. So then I'm standing in the elevator at one point, and I see this man. He gets into the elevator, and he's staring at this cross that's around my neck. And he says, "Why are you wearing a cross in Sin City?" And I thought, maybe because I'm trying to ward off vampires like you. No, anyway, so it was just kind of funny. Another thing that I recall seeing in Sin City was I got up at 6 a.m. to go to this conference to get some coffee at the Starbucks and that. So as I'm walking down the hallway to go to the Starbucks, I passed by these 2 women and a man, and they were dressed in the clothes from the night before. It was clear they were still drunk from the night before, and they were walking down the hallway, kind of wobbling back and forth. And I thought, this is Las Vegas. And so if we can try to picture that sort of an image and take it back a couple thousand years, I think we can kind of have a little bit of an image of what it might have been like to live in Corinth, which was known as Sin City. In fact, the Corinthians, they had this term called Corinthianize. Like if you said that somebody would Corinthianize, it would meant that they were living in debauchery. They were also known for their reprobate minds. They didn't have foundations or any sort of moral roots really in Corinth. It was a mix of people, but they didn't really have like a unified common moral foundation at that time. You had a mix of people who were Jewish or Greek or a number of other different groups living there. Same thing in Rome. Rome was just a bigger picture of this, but Rome had a mix of all kinds of different people worshiping a number of different gods. And so we know that at one point, Aquilla and Priscilla were sort of booted out of Rome, and they traveled around with Paul, and Paul chose to go right to the center, right to the epicenter of satanic activity as he went to Corinth. It's one of the places he went. And you can notice if you look at the New Testament and you consider the letter to the Corinthians and the letter to the Romans, you're going to see Paul really makes explicit calling out immoral behavior in those letters, especially explicit. And I think that might be because these places were so corrupt. They were so morally corrupt. And so did they have laws that were sort of trying to set moral guidelines? Yeah, there were the Julian laws that were put to place around 23 BC, which regulated things such as marriage and adultery. They said if someone committed adultery, if a daughter committed adultery, you're allowed to kill the daughter. You're allowed to kill the partner in an adulterous interaction. You were allowed to divorce your wife if your wife was adulterous. But you weren't, the husbands, they didn't have any sort of rules against them, interestingly. Those laws ended up being repealed. But anyway, that was just something that was in their time. So, excuse me. So I want to say hi before I move on here to Dr. Nose, Hate, Love, Nothing, and Impressive in the audience. It's always so good to see you guys. I don't know if any of you are familiar with my Twitter account, but I booted myself off of Twitter. I have a private account, but I'm no longer going to be public on Twitter. And so if you follow me or you were following me at my other Twitter address, I've turned it off. And I've decided to do that for a whole bunch of reasons. But I've been meaning to turn off that Twitter account now for probably since October, when I went off Twitter for 3 days and started thinking about, why do I have this account? What is it for? And I realized that I had been interacting with just a lot of hostility over the months. And over the years, people have contacted my workplace, and it's not worth the risk to my reputation or to anything of having all of these people who are so toxic in my Twitter feeds and going after my followers. And so I just thought, I just don't want to deal with this anymore. I'm just going to turn this account off. And so I did, even though it had 20,600 followers. Sometimes you got to do what you got to do. And my little account that I've got, my little private account, I've had that. That was actually my first account on Twitter. I've had it since 2010. It's only got about 800 followers. So I definitely shaved off a lot of followers by doing that. Some probably think that's a little crazy, but again, I don't see a reason to maintain an account like that. Twitter is moving increasingly farther to the left. It's become a sort of little microcosm of hell, as far as I can see. And it's not fun. It's not fun. My other account was not fun. The fun thing, though, is my new account, because I'm very, I don't allow anyone to follow me anymore. I used to on that account, but I closed it off, locked it on Friday, and decided that I'm only going to allow people I know to follow me, or people that I can tell, if I look through their timelines, have been consistent in their views and they're not toxic and are not going to be toxic against me. And so that actually, I've had about 15 invitations coming in from people who are very toxic to me on my other account. And so I have had to decline those invitations to follow. So I do that. And I've also fortunately had invitations from some of my former friends on that account. And so I think I've got 839 followers, and I'm following something like 827 people there. But anyway, if you're interested in, you're on Twitter and you want to follow me, and I know you're from here, just go ahead and let me know that. You can reach me at dash, DASH, underscore line, and then 023. I got that from Psalm 23. And the dash is because what you do during the dash between the day you're born and the day you die on your tombstone is really important. But anyway, I digress. So going back to this other thing. So here's what it says happened in Corinth, according to Luke in Acts 18. He said, after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquilla, a native of Pontus, who had secretly come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker, and they were as they were, that he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath, he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. And so it's really interesting that Paul did that kind of stuff. And so what was he saying? Again, think about the pushback that you would get if you were in this kind of environment. So I'm first going to explain the environment. So here's what Paul tells the Corinthians. He starts talking about sexual immorality. He says here in 1 Corinthians 6:12, I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but I will not be mastered by anything. You say food for the stomach and stomach for food, and God will destroy them both. The body, however, is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. By his power, God raised the Lord from the dead, and he will raise us also. So just think about that. Think about he is telling people who are living in a city known as Sin City about how they were supposed to live. Now, one of the practices that was pretty common back in ancient times was prostitutes were actually occupying the temples, and people were having sexual relations inside the temples to these other gods with these prostitutes. And so Paul laid it out that having sex with a prostitute, don't you know you're united in one? And so if you have sex with a prostitute, you're essentially uniting with that prostitute. And so he really called the Corinthians out. He made this very explicit all through the book of the Corinthians. Another thing just to point out that people need to understand, it comes right from the very beginning. And it says in Genesis, I'm going to go back to Genesis to also kind of make clear some of the issues of today and the confusion that people have. There's a big confusion. So if we go back to Genesis 1:27, here's what God said. It said, so God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish and the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. So again, God made it quite explicit that we are created in his image. And he makes it very explicit in these other books like Romans and Corinthians and Leviticus and Deuteronomy that we are not to be corrupting our bodies. Okay. This body is the temple. That's what he says. He says our bodies are temples. They are not to be corrupted. And so that's going against some of the things we're seeing today in society where people are corrupting their own bodies and doing a number of different things. And so let's go back to what Paul started off. Imagine if you're in Rome and you're living in a lifestyle where let's talk about that lifestyle first. So you're living in a lifestyle. If you have money, you lived quite a really intoxicating lifestyle. You were able to eat just about anything you wanted to. You'd had servants taking care of you. But what's interesting in Rome, just to think about this, they had no potatoes, no pepper, rice, sugar, corn, tomatoes, oranges, grapefruit, apricots, or peaches. They had none of that stuff that we sort of take for granted today. They ate their diets. If you were poor, your diet was mainly olives, olive oil, bread, fish, cereals. People drank either wine or water, pretty much. And so that was the diet. And one way that the leaders would appease people in these times is they would have the shows and the festivals, and they would have a lot of wrestling matches and festivals with gladiators. And so we had that kind of thing. So if you had some, and that's how the crowds were appealed. And you recall some old phrases like let them eat bread, those sorts of things. That's what people dined on, very inexpensive bread. But anyway, and they tended to not really eat too much at breakfast or lunch. The big meal was somewhere between 4 and 6. And a lot of the times their leaders were highly corrupt themselves. And so we have a lot of examples where these Roman emperors had boyfriends on the side. They sometimes if they weren't completely happy with them, they just tossed them over, tossed them off this roof or out of their homes. There's some stories about that I've read prior to this. But here's what Paul said. He makes it pretty clear here. The wrath of God, now this is in Romans 1:18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For they know God. They neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over to their sinful natures of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. And because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received its in themselves the due penalty for their error. Now, I'm pointing this out because, as I mentioned just a second ago, imagine you're going into Rome and you're reading the scripture. This was a letter to the Romans. You're going into the temples there. You're going into homes. You're talking to Christians, and you're bringing this news. This is calling out the emperors of the time. Okay, if you're actually going into the house, calling out the actions that the people who are in the highest positions of power are doing. Okay, we have examples of people like Nero, how awful he was. We have examples also of others. But imagine having that kind of taking that challenge. It's extremely daring to go and talk about the actions of the Romans and the actions of the Corinthians, and to try to say something that even goes against the highest, the people who have the most might. Now, so what were the reactions against these people? Okay, so the Christians were viewed in very derogatory ways, and they were treated in very much derogatory ways. And so let me just read to you some ancient sources. I'm going to show you on my screen here some ancient sources for how people reacted to Jews. I'm sorry, ancient Christians. So Josephus. Now, you're going to notice something that's really interesting. In ancient times, and I want to say hi to Slam RN, in ancient times, something very important just to note is that nobody ever said anything about Jesus not being virtuous. Okay, we have no ancient support for anyone saying anything like that Jesus sinned. Consider that the magnitude of that. We even have Jesus's half-brother saying he's Lord. Jude and James said that he is Lord and that he's worthy of worship and that kind of stuff. And if anyone would know if he weren't virtuous and had sinned, it would be the brothers who obviously spent their lives with him. And so just look at that. So think about that. And so you even have hostile sources saying how virtuous Jesus was. So Josephus, here's what he said. At this time, there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Okay, so they knew what virtue was. They might not followed it, but they knew what the moral standard, they knew there was a standard of virtue. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned them to be crucified and die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. Okay, so Josephus said this. He also talked about people being condemned to die. So for their actions, the Christians were condemned. Now, people did not like them because they didn't make them look good. All right. If you're a pagan and you're busy cheating on your wife, or your wife's busy cheating on her husband, some of the ancient people who were pagans actually looked at the Christians and they marveled at the Christian wives. So I read about that in Alvin Schmidt's book about Christianities, which I highly recommend. But here's Tacitus. Here's what Tacitus says. Consequently, to get rid of the report, now this is the report of what started the fire in Rome, which is this massive fire. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty. Now you're going to notice in ancient times, they often refer to the extreme penalty. That's another way to say the crucifixion. It was such a terrible means of death that they didn't even want to say the name crucifixion. They actually just called it the extreme penalty. During the reign of Tiberius, at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the movement, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So in other words, take a look at this. Rome, again, hideous and shameful. Really interesting when you think about that, okay? We also know, again, like I said at the outset here, Corinth was known as the sin city, as Vanity Fair. I think it's kind of funny with Vanity Fair, and as a carnal city, okay? Here's also what Tacitus said. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion. Okay, because they realized, for it was not as it seemed for the public good, but to glut one's man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. Okay, so the Christians, finally, people were feeling sorry for them. Now, Tacitus did really care about accuracy. We've had people, there's this woman called Candida Moss, and I've been listening to videos by people like Mike Winger about her, and also Sean McDowell. But there's this woman called Candida Moss, and she has tried to try to pretend like persecution didn't occur back in ancient times towards the Christians. And of course, or then she also makes claim that maybe they were killed because of their adherence to Christian laws and not to Roman laws. It doesn't really matter what the reasoning for their killing was. We know from ancient sources like Tacitus, it was merely for being Christians, okay? And so people like Candida Moss will discount the accuracy of books from Tacitus because she wants to claim there's this new narrative that she's created. But anyway, I digress again. So here's what Tacitus cares about. He says, in recording the death of Drusus, I have given the version of the most numerous and trustworthy authorities, but I am reluctant to omit a contemporary rumor so strong as it persists today. My own motive in chronicling and refuting the scandal has been to discredit by one striking distance the falsities of oral tradition and to request those into whose hands my work may have fallen not too eagerly to accept a widely circulated and incredible tale in place of truth, not corrupted into romance. See, Tacitus really cared about telling the truth. He wasn't making things up just to appease people or to issue propaganda. Here's what Pliny the Younger said about the Christians. Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I interrogated these as to whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed. Okay, what's the crime here? They were Christians. For I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness, and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished. Okay, whatever the nature of their creed. What's really interesting is what were the Christians preaching? They were preaching to be good, to be kind, to be truthful, to not care so much about goods. Okay, all of the things that they were preaching just happened to not fit the Roman greedy narrative. Now, Trajan responded to Pliny by saying this, you observed proper procedure, my dear Pliny, in sifting the cases of those who have been denounced to you as Christians, for it is not possible to lay down any general rule to serve as a kind of fixed standard. They are not to be sought out. If they are denounced and proved guilty, they are to be punished, with this reservation, that whoever denies that he is a Christian and really proves it, that is by worshiping our gods, even though he was under suspicion in the past, shall obtain pardon through repentance. So in other words, Trajan is saying that if the Christians renounce Jesus and start worshiping gods like Apollo and these other gods, especially some of the gods that they had that were, sexually oriented gods, then they would be acceptable. Now, of course, that's going exactly against what Jesus says not to do. We're not to worship other gods. I am the Lord your God. You shall worship no other gods before me. But anonymously posted accusations ought to have no place in any prosecution, for this is both a dangerous kind of precedent and out of keeping with the spirit of our age. So in other words, we have to go follow a procedure. They thought that they were doing the correct legal thing. Know something, just like today, sometimes the legal is not the ethical, okay? Sometimes what's correct to do legally, even in our modern society, there are some laws in place that aren't the ethical choice. I'm going to quickly divert over to one of them. In 1967, Colorado passed the first law that permitted abortion in cases of rape, incest, or the health of the mother. Okay, then a bunch of states followed, and by 1973, as you know, Roe v. Wade was passed. Now, what did they say in Roe v. Wade? Well, they said that the liberty of the mom is superior to the life of the unborn. In fact, they just decided that because that goes in direct contrast to what's given us as our God-given right in the Declaration of Independence and the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, where we're entitled to life, liberty, and a pursuit of happiness, because we're all made in the image of God. We're all people. We're all under God, we're endowed by our Creator. Okay, so to be able to get away from that, they decide that they will pretend that the unborn child who has become an unborn child is a human life that starts at conception. Science can't deny that the human life starts at conception. Okay, so we have a human life in there, and the liberty of the mom is going to take precedence over the life of the child. Now, that again is a violation of even our own laws. That's why this is so egregious. And so think about this when you're telling your friends about whether you think abortion is okay. Now, some of you might say, well, what about cases of rape or incest? Those are less than 1% of all cases. Okay, if we're talking about 99% of the cases of abortion are out of inconvenience. You don't legislate based on exceptions. Okay, just like we have murder is wrong. We have an exception of self-defense. Because people can defend themselves, does that mean that all murder is now correct? No. Okay, you don't legislate by the exception. So anyway, I'm going to mention another one. So Lucian said the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with a general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them. And then it was impressed upon them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted and deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them as merely common property. Okay. So then we have Mara Bar Serapion. He says, what advantage did the Athenians gain from putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment from their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain from burning Pythagoras? In a moment, their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. God justly avenged these three wise men. The Athenians died of hunger. The Sameans were overwhelmed by the sea. The Jews ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. Okay, that happened in AD 70, just as Jesus prophesied. Okay, Rome was destroyed. Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple at Jerusalem, the second temple, was destroyed. The Jews were dispersed out all over the world. It wasn't until 1878 years later, in 1948, that Israel was reclaimed. Okay, so the city was Israel was wiped off the map. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on the teaching of Plato. Pythagoras did not die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given. Okay, so that's pretty amazing. We've got a lot of extra biblical support. Here's Suetonius. He says, as the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Christus, he expelled them from Rome. Punishments under Nero were also inflicted on the Christians, a sect professing a new and mischievous religious belief. Now, again, take note of this. Okay, inflicted on the Christians. Persecution, plain and simple. Okay, and so we've got other ancient sources too that's confirmed certain aspects. We've got sources that basically say that there was an earthquake that occurred then. Now, I have found academic support today that's looked at the geology in that area, in the Dead Sea Basin, and they found that we've got evidence that an earthquake occurred in 33 AD. All right, we've also got people like Celsus saying that Jesus did have some miraculous powers. Okay, so we've got that as well. And so, again, some of these different sources, coming back to see you guys. We've got some of this different support. Oh, I see my good friend Sal. Hey, Sal, great to see you. I see Stripper Liquor, Evidence and Reasons, that's Sal, and Slam RN. So it's always good to see you guys. Really good to see you. And so the bottom line from what I'm trying to convey today is that it would have, number one, been very difficult to live in a society and to go against the push of the society, the ethical actions that were typical in the society back then. People were, again, living in Sin City. Prostitution was running rampant. We've got a lot of evidence of that kind of stuff also, just to mention, on pottery, ancient pottery they've recovered. We've got pictures and frescoes and things like that of some of the actions that they were doing. So Paul had to really push against that, and that's not easy to do. Now let's bring us to today. Today we've got some laws and some rules in place where people are, like abortion, where people are vigorously defending that and not even thinking about the fact that there's an unborn child in there. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I had my son, who they told me at 15 weeks, when I could see his little arms and little legs, that I could terminate the pregnancy if my amniocentesis came back for Down syndrome, if he had Down syndrome. I think that's pretty gross, okay? I could see the arms, I could see the little head. People are being told that you can terminate your pregnancy, that your child is a clump of cells. They're being told a lot of really terrible things today to justify this egregious act. How do they get the babies out? Well, let me let you know. If you're in a later part of the term, they'll actually go in there, suck the brains out of the baby to pull it out. Okay. Sometimes they carve the arms and legs off the baby to get it out of your body. Okay. They do a lot of really gross things. The D&E, take a look at that. Take a look at it, what a D&C is. These things are completely egregious, morally egregious. So I want to say hi also to Hate Love Nothing. I don't know if I said hi to Hate Love Nothing yet, or to Ear Review. So as you're traveling out there today, I'm just going to give you a little call to action. As you're going out there today and you're encountering people who are pushing against you for some very strong, passionate topics, and they tell you that you need to be more tolerant of people with these other views, they're not being tolerant of your views. Okay. If people are telling you, you as a Christian cannot hold biblical views concerning man and a man and a wife, or men and women, as I mentioned from Genesis 1:27, from the very beginning, first chapter, we're told that God made us in his image, a man and a woman. Okay. From what I mentioned today, just to repeat a little bit, Romans and Corinthians made it quite clear that we are sacred temples of God. Okay, we're not to go around violating the temple. And one of the worst ways to violate it is through sexual immorality. So try to be as good as you can out there today as you're traveling around. Now, for those of you, I see Ear Review says third trimester abortions are rare. That's true. They should really be non-existent, because usually I would expect that a baby at that point would be viable. So there's no reason after 20 weeks that we could justify killing a baby. Why not induce a birth? Okay, there's a governor in South Carolina who actually thinks that infanticide is completely appropriate. Can you imagine that? You got somebody like Peter Singer, who's an atheist. Now, I would expect Peter Singer is going to think something like that because of some of his other views. He's actually an ethicist, strangely enough. But when you're getting to the point where you're saying that a person is not a person until it travels through the birth canal, think about what you're really doing there. 10 seconds before the baby gets through the birth canal, to you is not a person. Okay. And then if you say, well, no, okay, I'll grant you, as soon as the baby's viable, it's a person. Okay. So 20 weeks, 24 weeks, the baby is now a person. Okay. Wait a second. How does that magically get conferred? That's arbitrary. There's an absolute here. At conception, the baby is formed. That is when the baby is a person. So anyway, I want to say thank you to everybody who showed up today. Please like, subscribe, come again. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I mentioned a little earlier, I've canceled my big Twitter account. I had a big account, LEAD 1225. That's gone. Got rid of it. Okay. I got rid of it because I just don't want it. And I found that it was very toxic. And I found that I was getting grumpy and agitated every time I got on Twitter. And so then I thought, well, I will have this really beautiful account where it's, and you can call it my little echo chamber, and I'm fine with that. But I've got my little echo chamber now. And if you want to follow me there on Twitter, it's at _023. And if you come and follow me, I will check your tweets just before you send me the invitation to see if I am a friend of yours, if I know you before or something like that. So feel free to come on over there and we can have a good time. And you will not see people responding to my tweets in really toxic ways because they're not there on my account. It's protected. It's just a beautiful thing. So happy. You don't even know how happy I am when I go to Twitter now. I get on Twitter. I only have about 800 followers there, and I really don't care because they're 800 really cool people. Okay. And so it's just been a joy. So for 2 days now, I've had a toxic free, very peaceful environment on Twitter. And I'm just really pleased about that. And I'm saying the same kinds of things I would say on my other account. It's pretty similar. I mean, I haven't changed it. I wouldn't be embarrassed if people came over there. If somehow an atheist makes his way or her way into my account, which is possible. There's a few who were in there before I locked it. They're not going to see anything that's anything different than what I have been posting all along. It's that kind of stuff. I want to spread the good news of Jesus. I want to be honest. And I'm going to say things that are going to make people uncomfortable sometimes, especially my views on abortion that I know make people uncomfortable. So anyway, yeah, Sal, I agree. Toxic free social media accounts are great. So yeah, come on over, everybody. So whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Thank you so much today, everybody. You guys have a great afternoon, evening, morning, wherever this finds you. Have a great day.